I'm Dr. Rex Rogers. It is my privilege to serve as the president of SAT-7 USA, which is a support office, as we call it, for the international ministry SAT-7, based in Cyprus, there in the Mediterranean. We're privileged to interact here for a little bit this morning with Dr. Terence Ascott. He is the founder and president, former international CEO of this ministry. So welcome, Terry.
Thank you, Rex.
I'm going to jump right into the questions here. 27 years ago, God allowed you to initiate a pioneering satellite television ministry in the Middle East. We know it was the first one in God's providence and maybe still the biggest. But what is it now, from your perspective, 27 years later, what's different in the Middle East and North Africa? Or is the challenge and opportunity pretty much the same?
No, it's a very different Middle East, and it's a very different set of opportunities too. Wars have led to all kinds of confusion and a massive migration from the region. It's led to a breakdown in law and order in different countries. The removal of dictators in Iraq and Libya have obviously had an impact and left these countries in a very unstable condition. You could say that there's a growing tension between Sunni and Shia Muslims across the region that's rather obvious. There's been a breakdown partly because of conflicts in Syria and Yemen and Libya and Sudan now and other places, in the education system, in the health services, in all kinds of social services. And in terms of ministry, there are two big things, I suppose. One is the loss of credibility of Islam in the eyes of many. We couldn't have imagined 27 years ago that, for example, there would be self-declared atheists in a country like Egypt. I mean, to become an atheist and say that you're an atheist is apostasy, and it's as bad as converting, or worse in some cases, for Muslim families in terms of the shame it brings on them. But we can see, obviously in Iran, where the mullahs have lost credibility, have abused their power as religious leaders, has led to a massive turning away from Islam in that country, with perhaps the fastest growing church in the world today. Over 1 million people self-declare as Christians today. I mean, that's phenomenal in a country where it's still very difficult and there's a lot of problems for people who convert to Christianity in that country, but they are openly declaring themselves as Christian. In other countries where the Islamic rule is a bit different, like Turkey, you have the AK party that's been in power for 20 years. People have said, we don't want anything to do with these religious hypocrites that govern us, but we don't want to, we still believe in God. So they call themselves deists. They believe in God, but they don't want anything to do with Islam. In Egypt, we had, after the Arab uprisings in 2010, 2011, an Islamic party came into power, the Muslim Brotherhood. That went terribly wrong. They were removed by force a couple of years later, and there's been a disillusionment with political Islam and what it can deliver. So that's all led to a new openness, at least by some of the population, in terms of their interest in the Christian faith. And then there's been this massive change over 27 years of technology. When we first started, we didn't even have a website. We had no email address for viewers to contact us. There was certainly no social media. There was no inexpensive and secure ways that people could talk to us, like WhatsApp or Viber over the internet. There was hardly any internet connection in many of these places. So this has been radical and has led us to launch a new app called SAT-7 Plus, which is an online portal that It provides all the channels digitally on a global basis, live, and also a lot of programming, a growing library of programming as a video on demand service. So yeah, massive change has taken place in these 27 years.
Terry, with all of that change, it's my understanding, I may be wrong, please correct me, that illiteracy is still a major challenge. I know it varies by country and varies urban to rural, but it's still there. And that seems to be one of the rationales or arguments for mass communications, for satellite television. You don't have to be literate in the way that you do to interact with the internet.
Yes, I mean, with all these new opportunities for digital media, it's mostly aimed at literate young people who have access and the ability to navigate the internet. But of course, there are, as you say, probably well over 100 million people in this region that are functionally illiterate. They could not read the front page of a newspaper. There are people who don't have an uncensored and uncontrolled access to the internet. And even if they do now, sometimes in times of crisis, it gets turned off. So we're really able to pursue these two strands at the moment. Satellite television is still king in providing people with an inexpensive, uncensorable set of video programs that will help people in two areas. One, we're trying to make the gospel available to everyone, especially those in closed homes, the illiterate, women, children, and so on. And satellite television is still king in terms of reach and uncensorability. And secondly, we're trying to support and encourage the church. And there are many isolated believers today across the region. And again, they rely on SAT-7 and the digital media to grow. I mean, some of these little groups of believers, new believers, they don't have any trained leadership of any kind, and we need to provide them with systematic encouragement and training in the fundamentals of the Christian faith, especially in countries like North Africa and Iran, for example, where you just can't provide local Christian leadership to these groups. So these are all important aspects of what we do. But of course, nobody knows the future. There's so many new opportunities that we're going to see. I mean, we talked a little bit about the new digital media, but with the rise of 5G networks across the region, with the increasing use of AI, with new developments in quantum computing, VR, the growth in the metaverse, nobody can even begin to imagine what opportunities there will be to both share the gospel and encourage and support Christians across this region in the next 10 years or even the next 5 years. I think any plan that goes out beyond 3, 4, 5 years is really guessing at what we'll be able to do in the future.
Terry, you and I both have friends that work in Christian radio. And I know Christian radio, not only internationally around the world, is tremendously used of God. It's in the Middle East and North Africa too. But I don't hear a lot about Christian radio in the Middle East and North Africa. Are Middle Easterners, do they access radio differently, or is television just really the predominant media in their lives?
Well, certainly it is the predominant media, but radio itself has metamorphosed over the last decade, well, the last 25 years. You've seen, I used to go around in the Middle East and have a little shortwave handset with me to listen to news and so on. It's worthless now. There is nothing on shortwave or even medium wave. And Middle Easterners tend to listen to FM stations. And of course, FM stations have got limited range. So you need a lot of them even in one country, and you need a license to operate in that country. So it has become more difficult for international Christian radio broadcasters in terms of finding audiences. Now, I know that some are busy putting up new stations in Turkey, for example, which is very difficult to do, but they are doing that and seeing some really good responses, because people do listen to radio when they're driving, when they're working around the house. It doesn't require your focused attention, and it still has a lot of value, but it has become more difficult that you can't cross borders very well with FM stations.
Now, I'm going to ask a rather elementary technological question. I should know this. Radio isn't as accessible or available on satellite like television. Is that correct?
Well, yeah, they've experimented with radio satellite channels, and we've actually carried a few for some Christian broadcasters as a test, but the pickup is not very good. If you've got a satellite dish and a receiver, you're going to be tuning in a television channel, not a radio channel. There are a few exceptions to that, but not many. And it hasn't been very successful in that respect, using radio by satellite. I know that in North America, you still use it for delivery to moving vehicles and so on, and homes. But in the Middle East, it's really not taken off in the same way.
Now, recently, Dr. Ascott, there was a outbreak of violence in Sudan. And there was some question among our staff, U.S. staff. We were asking ourselves, does SAT-7 really reach into Sudan? We know that Arabic is the language is the issue, not political barriers. And then we discovered that we've actually heard some feedback from Sudanese listeners who do watch SAT-7. And just if you could speak to that a little bit of how far our coverage reaches, or what we've heard maybe from Sudan.
Well, the broadcasts certainly do cover Sudan. We've always had low responses from Sudan, and I've always put this down to the lack of infrastructure in terms of the post doesn't work, the internet has been blocked very often, especially in times of conflict. Most people don't have a good functional internet connection. They use their cell phones. They're patchy. Until a few years ago, there was a fairly Islamic government that didn't tolerate very much in terms of Christian witness, and local churches were having all kinds of problems. People were migrating to South Sudan or areas where it was safer for Christians. So we've always had a low response, but we do have viewers. And certainly that's become more obvious in these last few days since the civil conflict between these two warring parties in Sudan started.
Thank you. Here's another technological question. I know it's virtually impossible to jam or block satellite televisions. One of the things I learned 15 years ago when I came on board that just kind of blew me away. I found that amazing. But it is possible, as you just referenced, to block internet connections or coverage, and various nations or governments do that. Can you just speak to that a moment? How is it possible to block the internet but not satellite television?
Well, satellite television is being beamed down from a satellite to an area. Now, there's two ways you can block it. One is you can uplink interference to the satellite, but that interferes with maybe 5, 6, 7, 8 channels on the same transponder, messes them all up. And satellite broadcasters get very upset by that, of course. And we've seen the Turks try to do it against Kurdish channels. We've seen the Iranians try to do it against opposition channels coming out of North America. And what happens is, for example, with Eutelsat, Eutelsat told the Iranians to stop jamming. They didn't, so they took off all 22 radio and television channels that belonged to the Iranian government off the Turksat satellites. After a year, they promised they wouldn't jam anymore. The only other way is to sort of put up a tower that's sort of in the same general direction as the satellite is located, and beam interference at the satellite dishes below, but it's extremely limited in its range and possibilities. I mean, they've tried that in Tehran. They had this very high-powered tower beaming into neighborhoods that were known to harbor people who had opposition sympathies with and watched these broadcasts from America. And what happened was they had to create such a high power signal to interfere with the broadcasts that it interfered with all the emergency service radio frequencies. Even people with pacemakers were dropping dead because of the interference. So that wasn't sustainable, and has been discontinued. In fact, the Iranian government is now sort of given up trying to either stop the importation of dishes and tunas or to jam, and have gone into competition with the other channels, trying to put up their own television channels and attractive programming onto the satellites to try and win viewers' attention and distract them from these rather, what should I say, low quality foreign broadcasts. Generally, the opposition channels don't have large budgets for drama or entertainment type television, and they're very political in nature.
Well, how is it possible that they can block the internet?
Well, that's because it's going through the telephone system and optic fibers and so on in and out of the country, or through satellite systems, all of which the government has access to and can just turn on and turn off whatever services they want. We saw that during the Arab Spring, for example, in Egypt.
Remember,
the internet was just turned off completely for a week. And then when they did put it back on, they started using it to distract demonstrations. They would say they put out false texts and messages on the internet saying, oh, we got to go to this place now urgently, but it was just a decoy to pull people away from major demonstrations. So yes, they have control on the internet. And the other thing about the internet is that if you're watching Christian programming or any kind of political programming on the internet, you're leaving a digital footprint that the government can trace and know what you're watching. The advantage of satellite television, of course, is there is no digital footprint. You turn it off, nobody knows you were watching Christian programming. And that's become a big deal in countries like Afghanistan, for example.
Very interesting. You referenced Afghanistan. I know we broadcast into Tajikistan now, amazingly. Sudan, we've mentioned. Yemen, of course, a very troubled nation. There are Christians in all these countries. And there is the body of Christ, the capital C, the church. And you've referenced a little bit some of the challenges of the church in the Middle East and North Africa. What are some other challenges that you might see in the next near term for the church itself?
Oh, wow. One of the big challenges is, I think I mentioned, is immigration. Many people have left these conflict areas. I mean, for example, in Iraq, there were 1.4 million Christians at the beginning of this century. After the conflicts and the war with in Iraq and the tensions between Muslims, Christians, and Muslims and Kurds and Muslims, many Christians left. In fact, there's probably only 200,000 or 300,000 left from that 1.4 million in the country. In Egypt too, during the Arab uprisings and the subsequent rise of the Islamic group and then the crackdown by the military, again, many Christians left for the sake of their families and so on. Obviously, Syria is in a very bad situation. Many people left Syria, including Christians, because they didn't want to be called into the army, or they got bombed out of their homes, or they just didn't want to be a part of the civil war. And there are a lot of Christians based in Syria, so it's been very hard for them. So you see this displacement of Christians, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges. And then you've got other challenges the church is facing, like Algeria. There have been massive church closures. 40 Protestant churches have been shut down in the last 4 years by the government on technicalities. Church leaders have been detained and charged with all kinds of spurious charges. And I suppose, along with the rest of the population, Christians and the church face this breakdown in public services, law and order, education, health services, and so on, which is also just encouraged migration.
Well, I have one more question, Terry. As you look ahead tomorrow, so to speak, at SAT-7's ministry opportunities in the Middle East and North Africa, what do you find most encouraging? And if there's anything, what do you find most concerning?
Well, I suppose the most encouraging thing is the younger people coming into the ministry to take leadership positions, to develop our digital media side and so on. That's been very encouraging to see. Perhaps the most discouraging thing is young people coming into the ministry. No. But yes, it's important that we find people that have got the passion for the vision of SAT-7, that is to make the gospel available to everyone in the Middle East and to support and encourage the church, not just the local Baptist church or this church, but all Christians across the region. And so my concern as we grow, as we bring in new people, just to keep that vision and mission clear and embedded in everything we do.
Well, I appreciate that, Dr. Ascott. That's one of the values of having the founder around to share that message from time to time. It's a very critical one. Stick to the knitting. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Rex.